Well, greetings, everybody, and welcome. Tonight we have our guest speaker, Chris DeWeese from Word and Way. Um, he will be presenting something really cool and really timely. So, give it to you, Chris.
All right. Thanks, Don. So this is my this slide tells the whole story that I want to talk about today, and I want to explain how Christianity ended racism and how secularism is bringing it back. I mean, that second part is going to be at the end, and I think it's going to resonate, particularly with an audience that knows their U.S. history and their world history. So what we have on the screen here right now is in the top left, my top left. I don't know how it's presenting to you guys, but is a fire hose. The firemen are about to spray the people to oppress them, to make them stop demonstrating. It would be handy if they had semi trucks. I don't think you could stop a semi truck with a fire hose, right? But it's interesting how history keeps repeating itself. But the fire hose was when the the civil rights movement was raging, and the people, black people in particular, were tired of being oppressed. They were tired of being treated like they were tired of being second class citizens. They weren't treated like second class citizens. They were literally second class citizens. And so you have the picture of the fire hoses and what they would use to disperse the mobs, the violent mobs of people who just wanted their liberty, right? And then here on the bottom left is Dr. King marching. And if you can see the detail, you can see that there's black guy, black guy, black guy, white guy, white guy, black guy, black guy. There's different races and different colored people who are marching. And then in the middle is Rosa Parks sitting in front of a white man on a bus. And then on the right are rows of Civil War Union soldiers who died. By the way, those are white people in those graves who died to end slavery, who gave their lives to do that. And so that's kind of where I want to go today. But these are images from our, aside from the Civil War, these are images from our recent history. The 1960s were only 60 years ago. Our youth today should be taught about these struggles. And they should be taught this in the real terms, in the terms of America had a problem, and this is how it was solved, and it needs to stay solved. So, I personally have loathed racism for as long as I can remember. I despise it, and it's larger than that. I do not like being categorized and judged. I don't like other people being categorized and judged, stereotyped, for lack of a better word. Now, sometimes stereotypes are true and they're funny, right? Because people, subcultures do develop habits and you can poke fun at it. That's another thing that's missing from our society today is the ability to make fun of each other and just go ha 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 and go home. I was taught sticks and stones can break my bones and words can never hurt me. Today, if somebody said something 20 years ago that is today deemed offensive, they're destroyed. And I don't care for any of that behavior because it's causing people to be dismissed willy-nilly without even getting to know them, without understanding why they said what they said, without understanding any type of depth about an individual or a culture. It allows for these very simplistic and immature judgments to be made, and it is very detrimental to our society. So as long as I can remember, I have not liked racism. I've despised it, and it's probably because I was brought up in a conservative American household where we actually believed what Martin Luther King said, and there's a reason we believe that, which I'll get to in a minute. This is all, I've always believed that each individual has a value and has worth, Yahweh does not create people for no reason. He doesn't just allow people to be born to have no purpose in life, and as particularly here in the United States, where everybody has these enormous opportunities. This is enshrined in our Declaration of Independence, and it's enshrined in our declaration because the people who wrote the Declaration understood that we are all made in His image. So when we disregard people's worth from external characteristics or biases, we actually cheapen society. We weaken it, and we place limitations that aren't there. So for society to make a change, it has to have common values. And that's what all the people on the screen here have in common is this old KJV. Now, Christianity in the United States has never been the type of Christianity that we on this group obey. The true one, where you continue keeping the commandments, you don't eat pork, you keep the Sabbath, you don't do Christmas, you do Passover. They never did that, and not in a large fashion, right? It's never been the overwhelming. It's never even been really enough to matter in the grand scheme of things. But what all of the Americans had in common was the New Testament. And the New Testament does have some pretty good information, right? Like salvation and eternity, how to get into the first resurrection. So how everybody had the New Testament is a very valuable thing, and it shaped their culture. And that's how we came to overcome these sins, and I'm going to call it a sin, of racism. And so one of the reasons that Yeshua came was to actually break down the wall of separation that had been put up. It's very, very important for us to remember that. And we can see with our nation from the Civil War from the Civil War on into the Civil Rights Movement, we ended slavery, but then we stayed bigots for how many 80, 100 years? We stayed bigots. So the same thing happens in the New Testament, because Peter was given a vision to tell him, you don't call unclean what Yahweh has called clean. He still couldn't get over his bias of not even eating with a Gentile. So these biases are strong, and they take a long time to get rid of. So we go back to the garden. In the garden, Yahweh makes a man. The word for man is Adam. It can also be the same word for mankind. That word is very, very easily associated with the color red because of his skin, his ruddy skin, his ruddy skin. Adam and Eve are always portrayed in our media as these perfect Anglo-Saxon specimens, but it's hilarious because they weren't Anglo-Saxon. They were darker skinned. They were probably pretty furry because they were not made to have clothing. They were made to be completely naked in the sunlight, if there was winter. I don't think there was winter back then, but they were made to live outdoors. And so the fair skin that they're portrayed as is not true. And we have to think about their complexion, right? Because they're made in the image of Yahweh. Well, if Yahweh had a complexion, wouldn't it be a combination of all of the complexions on earth? I think it would be. I don't believe that that we have this image in our head, particularly this group knows, this very effeminate Jesus picture that's put forth. Well, even he wasn't a white guy with blue eyes. He was a Semitic guy with probably dark curly hair and olive to dark skin. He was a Jew. And so we have to understand that this skin color issue is something that mankind has actually brought together. Now, it could be from the Garden of Eden. It could be from Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Don't know. Not from the Garden of Eden, from the Tower of Babylon, right? It could be from all that. We have ideas about that. But the point that I'm trying to make today is that these divisions are things that are the divisions are not things that we see in the New Testament. And then we move on to the Exodus. Moses had a Semitic wife and an African wife. Okay? Those who left Egypt were a mixed multitude. That was the intent of salvation all along. This is the same intent today. Now, these people were Semitic and not white. I know Whoopi Goldberg would disagree, but Semitic people are those, the descendants of Shem, or those who adopted a language from that region of the world. And they were probably all olive-skinned, or from North Africa, they were probably dark-skinned people. And did Yahweh differentiate when he gave the Ten Commandments? Did he say, okay, all you guys who are just hanging out here, no, I'm not talking to you. I'm only talking to the tribes right now. I am Yahweh, your Elohim, who brought you out of the land of Egypt. He didn't do that. He talked to the mixed multitude. Everybody present from all the nations that that Egypt had enslaved were there, and they all heard his voice. That is something to take to heart. So the nations in what we call the Old Testament, but what is also called the Tanakh, that were condemned, were not condemned because of their skin color. They were condemned because of their behavior. The vast majority of them shared ancestry with Israel. We're talking about the Canaanites. Abraham was in Canaan. Isaac, Jacob, Egypt, they come back. So they are kin to the people in the land of Canaan. Those nations were condemned because they either treated Israel poorly, or because of their false religion and their idolatry, or because of their religion, they did awful things. So we need to understand that when Yeshua returns and at the end of the age, this same paradigm exists. That final judgment is going to take into account how did we treat God's people and how did we worship? Did we worship idols or did we worship Yahweh? So our focus on the ultimate judgment, our knowledge of the ultimate judgment, should be how we judge today, as Martin Luther King said, based on the content of a man's character, not on the color of his skin. We know that judgment is based on works. That's what it says. The books are open, the dead are judged based upon the things which are written in the books, their deeds, their actions. So that's how we measure a person today. You can't measure a person if you just say, oh, he's got this skin color or that skin color. You can't measure a person if you just dismiss the person. You have to get to know the person. And perhaps along the way, you also should introduce that person to Yeshua, Jesus of Nazareth. And then they change their behavior. You change your behavior. You continue to, what do we call it? Growing in Christ. And that is how the path is walked out. So our common faith should be an overwhelming motivation for us to not have these biases, because we are not the chosen people. We're not. We're grafted in to the family of God. He didn't have to save us, or he doesn't have to save anybody, but through the shed blood of his son, he allows all who accept him as Messiah to become adopted children of God. And because of our founders' belief in those truths that are articulated in the New Testament, because they weren't really big on the Old Testament back then, even though the declaration of the laws do come into play later, but that shines through the Declaration of Independence, and that's how our founders believed it and how they enacted it. So there's probably 100 verses I could bring up to make this point, but this one I think is the most efficient and most striking. This is Paul, the person, was a strident Pharisee. Paul was somebody who was taught to loathe the nations. Paul was someone who thought he was the chosen guy, really. He was going to be one of the head rabbis of Israel. Paul gets converted, humbled, and baptized, forgiven, gives the mission to take the gospel to the Gentiles. And this is him writing to Timothy some 20 years after the ascension of the Messiah. And part of it says, first of all, then I urge that entreaties and prayers and petitions and thanksgiving be made on behalf of all men, for kings and all who are in authority, so that we may lead a tranquil and quiet life in all godliness and dignity. This is good and acceptable in the sight of God our Savior, who desires all men to be saved and to come to the knowledge of the truth. These racial divisions that were torn down in the New Testament times and then torn down throughout our nation's history are starting to make a comeback. But just from a simple reading of the Bible, of the New Testament, and I'm using New Testament, I'm not using any sacred names or anything today to show that it's just there for all to see. There's no kind of hidden nuance to it. There's no special hermeneutical tool you have to see this stuff. It's just plain as day. It says, desires all men to be saved. When we look in Acts 2, how many people were present in Acts 2 from how many nations? It lists everything. And those people witnessed the miracle of the giving of the Ruach HaKodesh. Well, there I have to use a little bit of the special words, right? The Holy Spirit. And they took it back with them to Persia, Asia Minor, Scythians, barbarians, Medes, Persians, as the list goes on and on. So the gospel was to go forth from Zion to all the nations through those who had made the pilgrimage, to take it back to their communities. It was a remarkable thing, one of the biggest miracles of the Bible. And then I'm citing Paul because his ministry makes it abundantly clear. All means all. All doesn't mean those who we feel comfortable with. All doesn't mean those who we feel safe around or don't want to be around. All means all. And after this, I'm hoping that those attending today will bring up the verses that are important to them, to you all, to say this is why I believe the same. This verse, look at this one, because there's so many of them. And it starts in the beginning of Yeshua's ministry in Luke 4, when he reads the Torah and he tells them about the miracles that were performed with the Gentiles. And he says, were there no Jews that could have been helped at that time? And they got mad. He was showing that the whole time, the information from Genesis to Malachi at the time, and then Genesis to Revelation now, the information was always for everybody, and the Jews had taken a stand to actually restrict that act. He was trying to correct that error, and he did correct that error. So Chris, you just said the divisions weren't meant to be. So if the divisions weren't meant to be, why did Yahweh allow Israel to separate in the first place? Why did he allow slavery and bigoted practices of the past? Well, I don't know. Nobody will know. I mean, we may know at the resurrection. He may reveal to us why he allowed these things to happen. But here's some pretty good perspective on that, I think. And we know why Israel separated, because when they returned from the captivity, the Jews resolved to not get busted again. When they came into Canaan, they messed up in the wilderness because they started dabbling in the wives of the nations while they were in the wilderness. When they came into the land of Canaan, they crossed the Jordan. You had one generation that was good. But even in the book of Joshua, at the end, he says, put away the idols which are among you. Even along the conquest, they had actually started adopting the practices. So when they adopt these pagan practices, they kept getting smote and getting smote and getting smote and getting punished and having divisions and having civil wars and getting beaten by the Philistines, and all these awful things keep happening to them until ultimately Yahweh takes them away into captivity, disperses the 10 tribes, and you know the whole story. 70 years, they're in captivity, come back, Nehemiah and Ezra build the wall, they read the Torah, and they go, you know what? We see what got us into this mess. We're not doing that again. And that's the birth of the separation. Because Israel was supposed to be the light to the nations. Israel was supposed to be so blessed that it was with Solomon that all the people came from around to say, how do we get to live this well? And then Israel was supposed to tell them, well, follow the Torah. Here, let me teach you. Put away the idols, put away the pork, keep these commandments, and then you go and teach everybody to do the same, and you'll have these blessings. But that's not what happened. Solomon allowed the idolatry to come in. So Nehemiah and Ezra in that day, what began turned into a very exclusionary nation, a very exclusionary faith, where even in Yeshua's day, they said, where did he learn this? Who is his rabbi? What if he teaches the nations all of his information? They were bothered. They were disturbed that the nations might learn Yahweh's will. Shouldn't they have wanted all along for the nations to know God? They maybe, if the nations knew God, they would have stopped worshiping those idols. So that's what happened. There was a lesson. And it was such a hard lesson that Yeshua came and started to help tell them about the Gentiles and tell them what was going to change. And then when he died and he was resurrected, he says, go into the world and preach the gospel to all the nations. And that's what the guys did. They walked. Paul used his Roman citizenship to go everywhere. Peter went over to Babylon, which is Persia, other direction. Right? We have history that they went all over the world preaching the good news of the kingdom of God. And what does that start with? Paul starts a riot in Ephesus. Put away these idols. He goes into the Areopagus. He walks into that pagan temple and says, let me tell you about the invisible God. He walked right into the nations and introduced them to Yahweh. He didn't say, okay, all you guys with the really dark skin out. I'm going to talk to the light skinned people. He didn't do that. He preached to everybody because that was his mission. So there's a parallel in that for mankind's historical racism. So while Christianity had grown and flourished from Paul's mission and the disciples' missionary work, over the past 2,000 years, people can't give up their biases. People tend to rationalize everything, right? All the wars in Europe, this country was founded because neighbor was killing neighbor all the time over doctrine and such. And these biases make it easy to dismiss people and go to war with them. Some of those people who can't give up their biases or don't want to become clergy, right? Or they're raised to hate another race and they're clergy, so they look at the scripture and they twist the scripture to justify it. They say things, what about those nations that were never allowed into Israel? See, it's okay to be racist. You can be biased. Well, you can't, because our mission is to preach the gospel to the nations. That's our mission. So, and we need to be honest with ourselves at this point. Very honest, very sober-minded, because Christianity is very often misused in order to teach the literal opposite of what the Bible literally says. Many, many topics. It's a shame, but it's a reality. Our historical racism was allowed to occur, just like many sins have been allowed to fester for a long time, so they could bring up a decision point. That's the moral of the story. We see these micro judgments as time progresses. the wars and rumors of wars, the Holocaust, and the fact that so many non-Jews had to die and go to war in order to stop the Holocaust and liberate Europe. And we see in our own Civil War a decision point. A decision point because our nation had become educated enough, in just generally educated, but in the Bible as well, to know better. And we knew that slavery, that having people be born into slavery was absolutely wrong. Even in the Bible, maybe there were permanent slaves in the Torah, maybe, but I seem to remember the 7-year freedom thing or whatever, and they weren't treated like the slaves of the United States. So the decision point came. How is America going to make this right? And we atoned for it in the most awful way with the most brutal war in our history, the Civil War. And I want you to think about civil wars and revolutions. In revolution, I don't mean by breaking away, but the internal revolutions, like the Bolshevik Revolution. We take the Bolshevik Revolution for an example. What was that about? Selfishness. It was about what's in it for me. The Bolshevik Revolution was, look here, comrade. I'm going to take away your got a chat. Oh, somebody. Okay. The Bolshevik Revolution was, you had these oligarchs, or these very wealthy, I don't know why there's different words for wealthy, powerful people in different cultures, but you had these wealthy, powerful people who owned the land and controlled the commerce. And then you have people who were not wealthy and who were not successful and who were just talkers. Sound familiar? Right? Just somebody who talks a lot, right? And they said, you know what? It's not fair. It's not fair that you have to work so that guy can get rich. It's not fair that you have to labor while those czars live in these fancy castles. You know what we're going to do? We're going to take their wealth and we're going to give it to everybody. And then we're all going to share the wealth forever and everybody's going to have the best life. They fought that revolution because of what's in it for me. They fought their civil wars in order. The same thing with the Maoist revolution in China, the Cuban revolution that brought Fidel to power. All over the place, these revolutions, and the same thing with Hitler's rise was he wanted to have the master race, he wanted to have the specialness, he wanted to have everything just for him and his people, and everybody else could be their slaves. It was what's in it for me. But in our Civil War is different. Our Civil War was white people going to war to free black people. They were going to war over justice. They were laying their lives down so that others may live. That happens in a Christian nation. And this is why my thesis today is how Christianity ended racism. And I don't know. I started going off there for a little bit. So we had more work to do after the war, right? After the war, we had more work to do. What happened next? The 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution made sure that the Bill of Rights applied to every individual, specifically so that freed slaves, African Americans, whatever you want to call them, black people, there would be no doubt that black people had the right to keep and bear arms, had the rights, the same rights as every other person in the country. That was the purpose of it. And Clarence Thomas, in his decision, in the majority opinions, recognizing the Second Amendment as an individual right, actually cited the 14th Amendment in that, saying that at this point, the Bill of Rights was applied to the citizenry. And so that happened because why? The war was over. The South was humiliated. There were dead people everywhere. Generations are suffered. And the will of the people was to put in place a law a law, a nationwide law, which is an amendment to our Constitution, to make sure that never happened again. That's what our nation did. And that only happened because white people decided that black people are the same. We're the same. And that is part of a Christian mindset where the curtain is torn in two and the wall comes down. The United States was still a Christian nation in the day of Rosa Parks. Oops. What's going on here? Boop. So in the day of Rosa Parks, the United States was still a Christian nation. And this is what she cited, C-I-T-E-D, when she refused to sit in the back of the bus. She looked at the white Christians as a black Christian and said, "You are all sons of God through faith in Christ Jesus. For all of you who were baptized into Christ have clothed yourselves with Christ. There is neither Jew nor Greek. There is neither slave nor free. There is neither male nor female. For you are all one in Christ Jesus. And if you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's descendants and heirs according to the promise." The United States was a Christian nation when Rosa Parks decided that, you know what? We're the same. We're the same because of the New Testament. We're the same because of Paul. We're the same because we worship the same God and the same Messiah. And that is how the civil rights movement started. She began the end of segregation by appealing to the nation's Christianity. Dr. King, a Christian minister, continued on this path and was very successful. And we must remember that segregation would not have ended if white people hadn't decided to end it. There have never been enough black people in this country to change one state's law. It takes all of us to elect representatives or to enact laws or to enact changes. And it was when all Christians of every skin color stood as the brothers and sisters we are and took the tear gas and the water cannons and said, you know what, enough's enough. And other Christians saw this on television and said, you know what, that's not right. That's not right that a black person has to drink out of a different faucet than a white person, that a black person can't walk into a diner and sit down and order a burger and fries because they're black of their skin color. That doesn't make any sense. That's against our faith. And so then segregation came to an end. And over time, racism was reduced to a minute faction of our society. It doesn't ever go away. But that's the way it is. You're not going to stamp it out. If even Peter, who had a vision from God to tell him not to be a racist, couldn't get rid of it, then obviously it's a hard thing to get rid of, and not everybody's going to get rid of it. But when you looked at the whole of society in the 90s and the 2000s, it's pretty good. And now I say that as a white guy because I don't have the experience of black people. But it was pretty good, you know? And this is how Christianity ended racism, because Christ ended racism. Now comes the bad news, the subtitle, how secularism is bringing it back. Because secularism and the forces of evil have been at work for decades to do what? Remove Christianity from this nation. Because that's the anchor. The Soviets knew it, the Chinese knew it, and they know that now that it's gone, they can do whatever they want to do to us. Because, brothers and sisters, if you haven't been informed, we live in post-America. We do. Churches are not thriving like they used to. The doctrines and stuff it's just not there. Racism is coming back because Christianity is disappearing. Grace and salvation to the nations is being replaced, or has been replaced, by secularism, humanism, and socialism. And what happens when we turn our back on Yahweh and his Messiah? What happens when you turn your back on God? He lets you go. He lets you go, just like the prodigal son. He lets you go. You think you got it all figured out? Go on. Have at it. Do what you got to do. And Yahweh and Yeshua, they let us reap what we sow. Forgetting our Christian roots is allowing those values to be replaced. But our enemies, the socialists, they don't want to really replace the values. They just want us to be valueless and have no anchor so that chaos can ensue, so that people who live next to each other have no idea about the belief system of their neighbor, because that's chaos. When you do not understand, when you don't have a foundation to work from, when you don't have a common morality with your neighbor, you're insecure about your relations with your neighbor. That causes isolation, it causes suspicion, and it allows people to start developing biases towards each other. So this is just another casualty in the war that Satan is raging against those who believe in Yeshua, because he thrives on division and hatred. That's Satan. He loves to mix us up. He loves to get us sniping against each other. Yahweh thrives on the light, which he created and which his son came to show us. So now this is a difficult topic to explain, but a culture is a foundation. And the benefits and detriments of a culture are its offshoot. So you start with foundation, and then you have sprouts of good and sprouts of bad. But these decision points that sprout up as beliefs or tenets or doctrines start from the core faith. So our national culture was based on Christianity. So the good that was born from our country is because our core, our foundation was Christian. We live in a post-Christian America which believes our blessings were based on humanism. Our decision, a man's decision to make a representative government. This post-Christian America believes in that our blessings were from our form of government, and that mankind made it without any divine information whatsoever. Well, today, secular conservatives, we have a new thing today. We have a lot of people who have an affinity towards conservatism without having the foundation of the Bible. They just believe that all we have to do is get back to the sprouts and life will be good again. But do you know that it won't work? It won't work without Christian morals. It won't work without Christians to be in charge. Because it wasn't just Christianity that formed the ideology that caused the Declaration and the Constitution to be written. They were both miraculous documents, as was the Revolution. But it was the fact that there were Christian people who were enacting these laws. People who knew that they would be judged by a higher power someday. If you do not believe in the judgment, then you can do whatever you want to do. And you can lie, you can cheat, you can steal, you can be a racist, because you don't have that core that's driving you to do the right thing. And let's just look at being able to face your accuser and not being convicted without multiple witnesses. Those are directly from the Torah, but our nation takes it for granted. We think it's always been this way. But it's unique to us and unique to Israel. It's a unique thing because the tenets of our Western society are founded on the Bible. So by extension, tyrannical justice is China. China is a tyrannical, atheistic country because they have whatever their leader decides is true because their leader is effectively their God. And the whims of man drive everything, which is why China's racist. It's why they're killing those Uyghur people, because they want to get rid of the competing core. So by extension, racism is just fine without Christ because he came to offer salvation to all who believe in him, not just to Jewish people who believe in him or Israel or whatever bubble that we want to put on it. That foundational truth is why we ended racism. Without it, mankind has no motivation to prohibit ourselves from bringing it back, because it is Christianity that says it is the greatest love is for one man to give his life for another, which is foolishness to the Gentiles. The crucifixion of the Messiah, who died so that we can have an opportunity for salvation, is foolishness to the nations. Because you see how violent and vile our society is getting today, because everybody is operating from a position of selfishness, not selflessness, which is the love of God. So because we are all children of Abraham and adopted children of the promise, I am going to do some illustration here. This one is for Whoopi Goldberg, because she thinks that Jews are just white people, but we are adopted children of God. And this is something Paul would have worn, something Yeshua would have worn, because it's not our culture. This isn't Western culture. This comes from a different culture, a culture of love, a culture of selflessness, a culture that tells us that we should live so that we should die so that others may live, just as Messiah did for us. So this one here is for Whoopi Goldberg, because she said that the Holocaust was just white people killing other white people. Apparently Whoopi needs to get some Jewish friends. So that's all I have for you guys, and I look forward to the conversation. All right, I'll stop my share and hear what you got to say.
And first up was Willard.
All right. Chris, I enjoyed and I liked what you had to say very much. You were accurate in all cases but one. And I want you to think about this. Part of the rewrite of history has been beginning after the civil rights movement. History started to be rewritten to make the Civil War caused by, and now I'm not disagreeing with your premise that Christianity ended slavery, in that it takes a Christian heart of white and black people both to come to a union, a meeting. The war itself, however, like all wars from the beginning of time, was caused by economics. Fort Sumter, South Carolina, was fired on by the southern states because they were blockading goods reaching the ports of Savannah, one of the few industrialized cities in the South. The northern cities were far more industrialized. I think if you look at true history, that the persecution and enslavement of blacks was just, if not more so, prevalent in the North than the South. Yes, a lot of blacks went north to certain areas, Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, because of the Underground Railroad. It was an escape, but it doesn't mean that conditions were ideal for blacks there. But like I say, the cause of the war itself was economics. It was not at all the issue of slavery. And so I just wanted to point that, but I agree with every premise you made, with that one exception.
Frederick Douglass disagrees. Next.
Alan?
Hey, Chris, thank you for presenting that. It was a great pleasure to hear that. I would like to just turn to two different things. Can I share my screen, Don?
You most certainly may.
Yeah, I'm going to focus just on the term all nations for a moment, if I can. And just blast through Psalms, where we read this here. That thy way may be known upon earth, thy saving health among all nations. Psalm 67:2. Psalm 72:11. Yea, all kings shall fall down before him, all nations shall serve him. Psalm 72. His name shall endure forever, his name shall be continued as long as the sun, and men shall be blessed in him. All nations shall call him blessed. And the next reference, he inherits all nations. The last one that I'll point to is Isaiah 2, and it shall come to pass in the last days. Now, we always took this verse to mean during the 1,000-year period, when righteousness reigns. Shall come to pass in the last days that the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established in the top of the mountains and shall be exalted above the hills, and all nations shall flow onto it. You could go through more of these kinds of verses and stack them up to make the point that you're making tonight, that he is the God of all nations. And through one blood, isn't that what he says there in the book of Acts? Through one blood, he made all the nations. So that was kind of the main gist of what I had there. I'm going to let someone else chime in.
Okay, I got my hand up. I'm in line here. The Civil War was very complex in its beginning. There were a lot of reasons. Yes, the fort was fired on. Why? Because the government was overreaching. The federal government was overreaching the states' rights. And unfortunately, the South depended very heavily upon manual labor. And that manual labor was slaves. But there was a lot of factors, and state sovereignty was one of them. Slavery was one of them. Economic equality was one of them. And I don't discount what you're saying, Chris, but there's a lot of factors in the Civil War, and history repeats itself. We are right now experiencing an overreach from Washington, just like the South did back then. So I agree with you, but there's a lot of factors involved with the Civil War. And with that, go ahead.
No, I get to talk now.
Yes,
I have had conversation upon conversation with people who try to tell me that the Civil War wasn't over slavery, it was over states' rights. You just got to play chess. It was over states' rights to have slaves. Okay, that's what it was about. And I mean, there's just no way around it. But I came here tonight to talk about racism. And if we want to have alternative history class, you guys can do that. Okay?
Okay, well, I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm saying there's a lot of factors involved. And that was one of the key ones. And you stated it correctly. Dennis?
Hey, Chris. Hi, Don. Hi, everybody else. I want to support a little bit of what Will said, but at the same time, I want to respect what Chris just pointed out too, right? Because the issue is about racism and trying to deal with that, right? And deal with it in our common culture. And the bottom line of that is that we have a culture that's turning away from that standard that says we can look at each other without looking at race, right? And Chris's premise is 100% right. At the same time, and I'm not trying to start a fight. I'm not trying to kind of do that. I want to acknowledge something that I think is relevant to today too, that lines with what Will's point is. The people, the common man who fought in the Civil War, their issue for the most part was about racism. It was about race, right? But the authorities, and when we look back, historians look back at history, they tend to look at the motives of the authorities that were involved as opposed to the people who actually did the fighting. And the authorities, and this is very relevant to today, those authorities, for the most part, not universally, but for the most part, it wasn't about race specifically, right? It was the industrialists of the North telling the South, stop paying for the livelihood of your slaves, make them work for a living, and let them pay for their own livelihood, right? They didn't care about the race part of it. And in much the same way, we see the same thing happening in our culture now from our authorities, looking at people saying, no, we don't want to be we want them to depend upon us. Not really. There's kind of a double play there. And so we can acknowledge that there's that economic aspect of the authorities and what they're trying to do that plays a role in it. I think it's not part of today. Today, I don't think it's based on race for the authorities. They're using race to divide people. And they're building that back up in order to divide people and get us all at our throats and attacking each other, right? And so, and I think that's a point to recognize. And in the Civil War, we had families fighting each other, right? And and they're fighting over the issue of race, but also the issue of culture that kind of plays with it too. And we see that happening today. And when we talk, and Chris, you made an unbelievable great point. We talked about our nation is founded on people leaving other countries and other cultures where they're killing each other, families killing each other, to come here and to build a life and a world. And our nation is built out of people who stopped and looked past that stuff and became united again, right? And they united on what? They weren't uniting around economics. They weren't uniting around money. They were uniting because God sent a revival and a Christian perspective across disparate colonies and peoples that said, we're not going to, we oppose being different in these ways and separating ourselves in these ways. We're supposed to be united, on the truth of God, right? And that brought people who were disparate together. And that's the whole point. That's what we're trying to keep. That's what we want to fight for, because we're supposed to have our identity in Christ, in Messiah, not in America, or not in race, or not in gender, or not in any of these other categories people invent and what have you. All that plays a role, right? And Chris's point, Chris, the point you're making here about our identity is supposed to be through Messiah, not through these other issues, especially race. And our world today is bringing it back as fast as hard as they possibly can. And it's a terrible thing. And I want to acknowledge that, but kind of like I said, I want to kind of acknowledge the other historical aspect too, because I think it's relevant to today too, because I think the authorities have never been aligned with the people. It was true in the Civil War, it's true today. And so anyway, there we, again, I'm not trying to cause dissension. I'm trying to help clarify.
Thank you, Dennis. Any other comments out there? Go ahead there, Alan.
Oh, yeah, Chris, I'm really glad you went over that material about the secular intrusion into our nation that has brought about the current state of affairs concerning foundations. You used the word foundation several times in describing that. And one of my favorite verses for that is in Psalms 11, verse 3. If the foundations be destroyed, what can the righteous do? Psalm 11, 3. If the foundation is destroyed, you've got exactly what you described. There is no absolute authority to declare what is true and what's a lie, to declare what is right and wrong. There's no absolute authority to enforce righteousness, because all you're left with is opinions. And all you're left with is the law of the jungle, which is big fish eat little fish. That's all you got. Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. So that's really, the direction of things in the educational systems with the full-blown Darwinism and on all the rest that is being perpetrated in Caesar's public schools. So we can understand that why they behave the way they do behave. And what shocks me is that when they behave in such a way, the administration at the school building is surprised, and they recoil in horror. Why did this child do that? Well, because he believed what you taught him. That's why he did that.
Yeah, he believed that he was just an animal.
He's just a bag of chemicals, and chemicals can only do what chemicals do when they mix.
Right.
And he should actually have no accountability for his actions because he can't help doing what he does. But that's something called determinism. It's a whole nother area of discussion. But the problem is when you don't have a foundation, you cannot have a criminal justice system.
Right.
You really can't.
Yeah.
Because now you're enforcing opinions when you have a criminal justice system. So I appreciated you going into that aspect of it, where when you bring a person to that and they buy it and they accept it, then yes, they can mistreat other human beings in whatever way they decide to.
And the same thing goes with, I think about presidents. Why do we put our hands on a Bible when we take an office, right? Because you're about to be given power, and the only person who's really going to know if you use that power justly or not is God. And so that foundation, that foundation is so deep in our society because our jury system depends on 12 people making judgments that they will answer for someday. And our judicial system and our system of law calls Yahweh the highest power. So that way, the people who are in power, you may sin today, you may be mean today, someday you're going to have to answer for the stuff that you do. If that does not exist, you get CNN's staff. You get Governor Cuomo. You get all of this arbitrariness where in the cancel culture, where whatever they it can go 24 hours. I was actually watching Fox News the other day, and they came up with a thing about should people who get unruly on a plane be thrown on a no-fly list. And I watched as they came to consensus, yeah, I think we're okay with that, right? Because they needed each other's validation in order to come to a thought to say, is that okay? Well, obviously as an individual, you should be able to determine that if somebody gets drunk and belligerent and takes a swing at a flight attendant, they don't get to fly anymore. That's okay. But our society doesn't want to have any rules or any judgments or anything like that. It wants nothing but chaos. And the only way you can have a rule is through consensus. But consensus changes as time goes on. And that is exactly what you're talking about, Alan, because you have the rule of the jungle at that point. Agreed. Tagore, go ahead. Or Don, you can choose who gets to go next, and I will sit here and take questions.
That's all right. Tagore is next.
Okay. I have permission to go?
Yes,
this
your
is
hall
very-
pass has been honored.
Thanks. This is a very complex subject, Chris. This racism, I have been thinking about this a lot. And let me summarize my thoughts around this subject and then come to your message. And I have one comment to make. By the way, great presentation. I'm not critical of anything what you said. When I arrived, you and me arrived on scene, we come to exist on the earth. I see great inequalities already there. It's fact. Not everybody is equal. There are small and they are great, and great intellects, mental and physical faculties, abilities. God gave a lot to some people, and probably he withheld to others. And scriptures from Genesis to Revelation prove that what you sow, you reap. So we are seeing the end of what people have already sowed and what is being reaped. And then God withholds blessings. And sometimes, even in Amos, I see he causes a nation to be enslaved. We saw this for several Gentile nations and also for Israel and Judah. I don't see any exception for any nation that guaranteed not to be enslaved, unless you're absolutely in right standing with God. So having said that, both empirically what I observed and what scriptural support, there are great inequalities. Some people are incapable of putting hard work. I don't know how God withholds blessing, withholds things. Maybe I'm going in the direction of racism, but objectively, I see what I'm speaking what I see. There's a great inequality already set on stage when I arrived on scene. And with all this background, I am baffled with this command. Comes from God. Love your neighbor equal to yourself. Now, how is that possible with all great inequalities that are in place for whatever reasons? You may not agree, sowing and reaping, but God commands us, everybody, both for small as well as great. Everybody was commanded to love your neighbor equal to yourself, same as yourself. And much of the people, in some or other extent, stand in violation of that command. That's where the racism stems, I think. And ultimately, we would be judged when we all stand before judgment seat of Christ. What we did with this fundamental teaching of God, that love your neighbor equal to yourself. I'm not talking about a very specific denominational doctrines. I think every denomination agrees, and every denomination knows if you say you are Christian, but there is a colossal total failure of people who profess to be Christians, leave non-Christians. So coming back to your message, Christianity took away racism. That's true to some extent. But I would like to add an adjective. The true Christianity took away racism. If I may add that adjective. I think I spoke more than 2 minutes. I end my talk.
Oh, I must have not paid attention to the rules on the 2 minutes. But the because I like talk for 45. The other Tagore, what you're talking about as far as starting off from a place of inequality is a generational curse, and that's when it says it's going to visit the iniquities into the children under the third and fourth generation. I'm sure there's a literal application to that, but I view it more figuratively. That our sin of slavery that we paid for with the war didn't end there. It continued through the civil rights movement. It continued through until today, because these generational curses, when you make big mistakes, they last a very long time. And in the Torah, it's actually the Torah that says love your neighbor. When Yeshua, Jesus says that, he's actually citing the book of Leviticus. So from the get-go, Israel was supposed to love their neighbor as themselves. And there's also another one that says there will be one law for the stranger and the native among you. So whoever happened to stroll into the nation of Israel, even though they were ignorant of the law, they were still benefactors of the law. That's another form of racism and bigotry, when you have a country that has different rules for different people. And maybe, Tagore, you'd like to speak about the caste system in India, because we Americans have no idea about a caste system, a little bit, because we see our wealthy. The other one is the inequalities that Tagore was talking about. Having inequalities is a mandate. It's mandatory. If you think about the people who built the tabernacle, some knew how to draw, some knew how to hammer, some knew how to saw, some knew masonry. They're not equal because they're different, and some had no abilities like that whatsoever. Being different doesn't mean you're unequal, but the inequalities will be in the kingdom. I mean, Yeshua says that these people will be least in the kingdom, and some people have mansions and some people have this, and some of the apostles were given enormous responsibility, and some of them we hardly ever hear about. We don't even have a letter of, right? But that doesn't mean they didn't do big things, but not having the equality of outcome, I guess is how we put it in federalist terms. You have the equality of opportunity, but not the equality of outcome. Because we even see with the parable of the talents that sometimes God blesses people greatly for some reason, and he doesn't bless other people others. But the point is for us to get into that kingdom. And I think everybody on this call would be very happy to mop the bathroom floor of the kingdom rather than not be in the kingdom. So I hope I answered. And I think only Tagore's hand. So
Yep, go ahead, Tagore.
Yeah, completely agree. Chris, generational curses. Others might use a different phraseology, but it's always something to do with sowing and reaping. Having, as you refer to caste system, it's a special kind of racism institutionalized. This exists in India, and you are born into a caste, and you cannot change your caste. You cannot move upward or downward. They have 4 primary castes. Top is Brahmins, who claim to have come from head of the creator God. And then you have Kshatriyas, that is warrior class. Most of the kings and royalty fall into that. And they claim that Kshatriyas came from shoulders of creator God. And then third is Vaishyas, that is traders, trading community. That itself is a caste. You are born into that. And then the third category came from waste or something like that. And then the last category is Sudras. Sudras, primarily how they define is whoever is not of first 3 categories is Sudra. And Sudras are rest, and they are mostly different artists, artisans, and they have specialized skills, some in pottery, some in metal, and you have various tradesmen with special artistic abilities. They're all Sudras. So you are born into caste. You cannot change your caste. You cannot move up or move down. That was until I would say 100 years ago in Indian history. Now, gradually, the caste system is disappearing, and India is going into transition into class system, upper, middle, and lower classes. So the three classes fastly catching up, and there's always exception. If a lower caste is there, if you are wicked rich for some reason, people don't care. Like they would make friends, and then they will give, they will marry also. If you are poor, as Bible says, you would be hated even by your own relatives and friends. So all the caste burdens would be put on that person. So there are economics also behind the scenes, but there are some instances where lower caste people, they came together and they declared, usually all the rich people in some lower caste would come together and they declare themselves to be a new caste. And they stop intermarrying with their former caste, and they evolve into a small branch of new caste, and then they move up the ladder. So you have different strange dynamics in Indian history with all these movements. And as we see, like slavery, different types of slavery, different types of discrimination, different types of hatred and segregation and separation you see in different countries. This is a special case of institutionalizing racism. So underlying spiritual movement is clear violation of loving your neighbor equal to yourself. I think small, brief history class.
Thank you. Come on, guys. I said some inflammatory stuff or intriguing stuff.
Well, there's always Dennis.
There you go. There's some hands.
That was pretty funny, Don. So actually, I kind of want to hear you talk a little bit about, when we talk about slavery, and you pointed about, Chris, about how in the Old Testament that you hit the question, was there permanent slavery in the Old Testament and everything? And I thought that was it was an interesting thing to say. But when we consider, and this is something I think all of us can unite behind if we think about it, the Sabbath, the Sabbath is so important to all of us, right? Yet when we consider what the Sabbath means and we study what the Sabbath means and we look at everything that's tied to it, the whole purpose of the Sabbath is to bring us freedom, is to release us from bondage. Remember the woman who was bound to Satan for 18 years, and the synagogue owner was like, you've got 6 days to do work, come back and be healed in those days. And Yeshua says to him, he goes, isn't it right that he healed her on the Sabbath day? Because the whole purpose of the Sabbath is to be released from our bondage. It's one of the signs that in Deuteronomy, when he's given the 10 Commandments, is exactly what the commandment says. And the fourth commandment was that the reason you have the Sabbath is it's a sign that you've been released from slavery. And so I kind of want to hear you talk a little bit about that because of how much the Sabbath means to everybody.
The application of the Sabbath is that it's universal. It's it's all encompassing. It's the terminology. Let me go read it. It's actually longer in Deuteronomy than it is in Exodus, but Exodus 20 says 6 days. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of Yahweh your Elohim. In it you shall not do any work. You or your son or your daughter, your male or your female servant, or your cattle or your sojourner who stays with you. For in 6 days Yahweh made the heavens and the earth and the sea that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore Yahweh blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. So it's everybody. It's if the world kept Sabbath and Israel kind of keeps Sabbath. They're pretty close. You couldn't do anything except keep Sabbath on Sabbath. There's nothing else to do. So it includes the slaves, it includes the children, it includes the oxen. It's all businesses should be shut down. Now, I know I don't mean like we should go do that to them. I mean business should not be conducted. But if it was, I mean, in the millennium, there's not going to be any activity on the Sabbath or anything like that, and that includes the slaves. And I did look up really quick. It is the if a Hebrew if their countrymen sold themselves into slavery, it was 7 years. I think they could own foreign people in perpetuity, but it was nothing like what this country did to the black people by just keeping them slaves and then just fully impoverished and just treating them like cattle. That wasn't like that at all. But I hope you answered your question, Dennis. It's a pretty short one. The Sabbath, and Yeshua says the Sabbath was made for mankind, right? The word there is anthropos. If you take the word anthropos as anthropology or mankind, if you go back to the Septuagint, when the Sabbath is made for Adam, Adam equals anthropos. So anthropos, Adam is mankind. That equals anthropos. So it means the Sabbath was made for the whole world. So it's not exclusive to just the Jews. So that was quick. Gail, next. Sorry.
Go ahead, Gayleen.
Oh, hello. Okay, from the Philippines point of view, we have your constitution, and so we're just aping the US. But before even the US came, so I'll give a little history. Before the Spaniards came, we are now told, and not all the young people know, that most of the people in the Philippines were educated. I mean, they could read and write and do math. That's before the Spaniards came. And then they erased everything, our history. So, and then the only ones who can read and write are the priests. And so there was like a caste system too. But this time, the Spaniards were the high end, and then the mestiza, that means the hybrids, they're on the second level, and then the last one are the natives. So the natives, or the tribal people who were really up to now pure, some of them are still pure, they hid in the mountains. So now only in the American times, maybe some of them came down. Okay, and now when the US conquered the Philippines or bought the Philippines, I don't know if you knew that. That's why we have a better grasp of English. Those who came in the 1900s brought a different kind of Christianity. Under the Spaniards, we were like slaves as well. So, but the rebellion was long in coming because we are islands and they divided us. So, so when the Americans came, you came in. Those who came here were soldiers and missionaries. Soldiers to control, to exploit the land, but there were Muslims in the country too, in the south. So the Spaniards fought the Muslims, which was good. Here in Palawan, I just found out that the natives were hiding because the Muslims would raid their towns. Before, they didn't just hide, they fought the Muslims of that time, on Spanish time, because I was saying, is there a fort in Cuyo and a fort in Taytay? These are Spanish forts where it's just like Israel fort of the old olden time, or the castles in Europe. They have the walls, and then the people are inside in the church. So we were wondering what's this, and they would even, I don't know now, but when I was a little girl, some of the workers would say, "Oh, you better be good, or the Muslims will get you," because they would raid the islands, get captives, and sell them as slaves. So that's what the Muslims did. So up to now, we are resisting the Muslims.
Yep.
So it's a religion that we're looking at. Although before the Spaniards came, there was also slavery in our country, but it was different. It was not like the slavery there in the U.S. Here, even the slaves had gold earrings. So they were like, everyone was rich in gold. That's what we're told, in the areas that there were lots of gold. So it's a different kind. It was more like maybe the American Indians, but the American Indians did not have slaves. Here, there were slaves. So, okay, we go back US. So we are so grateful for the United States for bringing in the missionaries, because they really gave the Bible, the Word of God. Because in the Spanish time, you just only, because it's Catholic, only the priests know everything. So that's the difference. But we are so looking through you to you that even our politics is influenced by you up to now, because they look to the America as the big brother, the one who saved them even from World War II. So slavery here is not, it's more like what Tigor said, it's the class system now of the rich and the poor. And
Yeah.
that's where, for example, my ancestry is mixed. My mom said in the islands they were very much discriminated because they are half-breed Chinese, and then the half of it is Filipino Spanish. So what they excelled in is their mind. They were very intelligent. So that's how they rose to political and social prominence. But still, it was all because of the education that the Americans gave during the 1900s. So what we are confused, and you are right that the communism entered your country through the doctrines. Here, that's what we are now fighting for, because there's the LBQT thing, that
Yeah.
because predominantly Catholic, we are against abortion. So we never took that into being. But because
Praise
it's
God.
Catholic, there's still a lot of idols. And that's the why there's so many typhoons, I think. So, but
Might be.
those who have to stand up has to stand up. So that's my what I see happening to your country and your history, which we are connected, unknowing to most of you. We were your vassal till 1946, I think, or 50. After the war, we were still a Commonwealth of the United States, World War II. So we only got our freedom from your country after. But Guam, there are still islands that are connected to you, and places like, I think Puerto Rico is like almost like the state of the United States. So every time somebody compares us to or I just say, look at the US, what's happening to them? We don't want to be like that.
Yeah.
Everyone who wants to go to the US is going, you want to go to California? Look at what's happening there. I want to
Even
shock
you
them
guys
to
know.
realize our lives is better here. So thank you so much. So that's my my report here from the Philippines.
Thanks,
God
and
bless.
God bless, and hopefully someday we go back to being the big brother that we ought to be. So, thanks for your testimony, Gail. Appreciate it.
Amen. Actually, in the military, you're still being looked up because the president here was waving. I mean, he pro-communist, pro this, and even we didn't realize some islands were sold by the other president. That's why going, oh my goodness. So, but the military is very strong, connected to the U.S. Even if the president wants China, the military said no. So that's good.
And I was in
There's
Manila once when I was in the Navy, and I was received well. I'll tell you that, but that was a long time ago. So,
it's still the same. I mean, because of maybe the light skin, but we are hospitable people, and everyone's welcome. I even know recently Malaysia and Indonesia closed down its borders to foreigners, and they escaped here, and they're still hiding here. These are yacht
wow.
captains right now in Palawan. So um, we understand, and that's what's needed now is unity and love. As you have also pointed out, that's what the Lord always wanted us to be, equals.
Amen.
So thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, Dennis, go ahead.
So, hey, Gail, I want to say thank you for showing us some of that history of the Philippines. And I know a lot of people here in America don't know about what happened and how we're connected before World War II. You know, there was a long history there, and but it also what your story highlights that the issue of racism is not something limited to America, right? It's not limited to here. It's a serious problem everywhere. You see the same kind of things, the same kind of the spirit, and I think that's really the point, right? It's the spirit that leads to, you know, this evil spirit that leads to treating people this way based on nothing more than you're not me, you know, you're not one of us type of thing, you know, attitude. And and that kind of, I think that's really the heart of Chris's message. And Chris, you can correct me, you know, at least for free, but that the spirit that is anti-God, is anti-Christ, that is anti the word, right? You know, is anti-Torah, all these things that lines up with God, that spirit that's against that looks to create those divisions and plays on those divisions and creates that kind of hatred. And when we reject God, we reject, you know, the camaraderie that's supposed to exist there. I like how Chris said it, the big brother kind of relationship, right? But you know, a brother is a family member. You're family. You're together. You're supposed to walk together in unity and in agreement. You know, but you know, Satan wants us to be divided from that. He wants to separate us from that. He wants us to not be. He wants to be us united against God, right? And the key to do that is just be united, divided against each other, until the strong man comes to bring us all together under his program. And so when we think about this, we look at what you described in the Philippines with the Muslims and in the Spanish, and we think about that as Tagore is describing India. We can think about China and Chris, I never pronounced the Uyghurs, that group. appropriately. We can think about Japan today. We can think about various other nations, but for some reason, on the political stage now, internationally, it's America who's evil for their racism. It's a human condition. It's a human problem, and we want to make sure we don't fall back into that, right? We want to remember that, and I think this is Chris's point. Christianity, following Messiah, is what eliminates that, and it's good to remember that this is a sin that isn't exclusive to us. I don't want to minimize it, right? From our perspective and from the role that we played historically in those issues and everything, but we can't forget that it's not limited to us. It's worldwide. So therefore, there's something we can relate to the rest of the world when we deliver that gospel to the rest of the world. God's about freedom. He's not about slavery, right? And it's just good to hear that testimony, Gail, where it says that, it's not something that's just us. It's not, we're some special group that only us goes through those trials. Only we overcame those things. Only us. All of us are walking together in that.